Oh, Dear Dad would be a good one.
April 8th, 1984, Joe Todd, an interview with Mr. Clemon Kelly. Sir, where were you born?
Where was I born?
Yes, sir.
In Watonga, right 2 blocks down the street here. In a brick house, you can see if you drive by. It was one of the, first houses of some standing in the community. It was built the same year this house was. Mr. Ferguson and Dr. Kelly. My father was a pioneer physician here. He came in 1893. That was the year after the.
Okay.
I think Mr. Ferguson came a few months after the opening himself. Yeah.
When's your birthday?
December 15th. I was born 1902 and born in that house there.
Who was your father?
My father was
Yes.
Dr. W.R. Kelly. And after practicing medicine here a number of years, he organized the First National Bank and was president of that for several years.
And who is your mother?
My mother was Iva Carpenter Kelly. She came down here at the opening. Her first husband was a druggist, and they had a 2-year-old child, my half-sister Cleo. And the year after they got here, why, he died suddenly, 1893, and my mother got along here as a widow with a child. She took a job in the county courthouse, and I think she was deputy court clerk. And my father and she were married in 1896. That would be 3 years later. And I wasn't born until 1902.
Where'd your father go to medical school?
College of Physicians and Surgeons in Chicago.
How come he came to Oklahoma?
I think he came like most people came because he wanted to make a living in a new country. He was not a person of any personal wealth himself at the time, and I think he said he came for a couple of reasons. One, that he liked Watonga, and second, he didn't have any more money, so he had to stop.
Did he stake a claim here?
No, my mother did, however.
Your mother did?
No.
Okay. Where was her claim?
Out west of town.
West of town. Was it quarter section?
Yes.
Okay. And where did your parents live in town?
Well, my parents first lived, as far as I know, on Main Street.
In this brick house?
No, not here.
Okay.
On Main Street and Eura Street, Leach, Main and Leach, the southwest corner. And he, I think he built a wooden house there, several rooms, and practiced medicine. He had a couple of ponies, or horses, and a barn out there. I have a picture of him with his horses and barn, and they lived there for a number of years, and then they lived at the south. Let's see, that'd be the northeast corner of town here on this farm, right north of town, and he had a brick kiln there, and used that to build a large for Watonga business buildings on Main Street. He was a kind of developer and enjoyed doing things of that kind. He built the First National Bank building there, where he became president of the bank.
Where did he get his clay to fire the bricks?
I don't know what the process was, but there was I'm just not that much of a mechanical person that I ever delved into that. But he did operate that for a number of years. I remember, for instance, the First Christian Church down here had a centennial or something not long ago, and they were talking about getting the bricks from Dr. Kelly to build that First Christian Church. That is about 3 blocks north of Main and Noble there. And so he provided the building materials for a large part of those early buildings.
What are your, tell me some of your...
Including his own house.
Oh, okay, right. Tell me some of your childhood memories of Watonga. What was the town like?
Shall I tell everything?
I suppose you're supposed to. I did. He just got through.
Oh, he got through interviewing you. Well, that's fine. Well, I would say that as far as I was concerned, Watonga was a wonderful place. I was a favored citizen, given lots of attention, and I had no reason not to enjoy Watonga. I can remember, of course, going in and out of the stores there, and I remember, I believe it was about 4 years of age, I ran up a big bill at the confectionery, and that went on until my father stopped the billing. But,
Who ran the confectionery?
Charlie Smack was the confectioner, and one day I came in there and he said, "I'm sorry, but there's no more charge," he said. Of course, I'd gotten by probably for a month or two, ran up quite a bill. But,
What would you buy when you went in the store? The confectionery store?
well, as far as I know, I would buy anything the proprietor would sell me, which was probably very liberal, you know.
What were some of the other businesses in town at that time?
Well, I had an uncle here who was a proprietor of a dry goods business. I guess the largest dry goods store in the town at the time, and men's furnishings and so on. Of course, I spent some time in there, and he did a large amount of business with Indians, and in fact had an Indian department in his store where he sold these Indian artifacts that they would make and come in and, of course, dispose of them to him pretty cheaply because they needed the money, and it was a good business. He in turn provided them with these Pendleton blankets and all kinds of things they needed. They got government stipends, and they came in the store and spent money quite liberally. It was authorized by the government, and his Indian trade was an important factor in his business success. He had come over from Kingfisher. He came to Kingfisher first and worked in a dry goods store over there and proved up a claim while in 1889, and then when this country opened in 92, he bought dry goods from his boss and took a wagon, came over and set up in business in a tent on Main Street.
What was his name?
J.H. Wagner, James H. Wagner. But he did very well in business here. Over, 25 or 30 years followed.
Was your father the first banker here in town?
No, he was not the first banker, but his bank was the biggest bank at the time it was organized. It was the First National Bank, and there was a banker before then, but in those days, you could be a banker and still not have much money in the bank. Right. Let's say you have $100,000 deposits, you were in business, and people just didn't have much money. but still it was a bank, and it was capitalized for $25,000 and prospered. And
Was your father the first doctor in Watonga?
no, he was not. He came the year after the opening. There was a Dr. Van Brunt here before he was here. I know of that, and he became a partner of Dr. Van Brunt. He went into business with him. And Dr. Van Brunt continued in business here for many years, and there were 2 or 3 other doctors that were busy physicians. And my father, usually both Dr. Van Brunt and Dr. Kelly owned a drugstore. That was part of the trade in those days. You not only prescribed, but you had a drugstore. And so people, you got them going and coming. He ran a drugstore here, and I know at Geary for a while. He ran a drugstore there too. That was quite legitimate in those days for doctors to be a druggist.
Did your father just practice general medicine, or did he specialize?
He's just general medicine. Just
general
went out in
medicine.
the country, you know. There were no fences in a lot of places in those days, so you just took your buggy and ponies and went out and went direct to the patient over the
You ever go with him?
prairie. No, I never did go with him. No.
As a child, what kind of chores did you do around the house?
Well, probably in early childhood, I really didn't do much around the house. I happened to be pretty frail. In fact, they brought in my father, of course, had a lot of patience. He brought in a Negro mammy to feed me, because I couldn't get along on my mother's milk or any other substitute he could find. And I believe that is given credit for pulling me through, you know. But he had help around the house and so on, because in those days you didn't have to pay people much. You could get a yard man and a cook and all those things pretty reasonably if you were a professional man in town.
When did you start to school?
I started school at the age of 6 years, down at the area where the public library is now. They had a school building down there, and I entered the primary school there.
What was the name of the school?
Well, it was the Watonga Public School.
Okay. Do you remember Statehood Day?
Who?
Statehood Day, 1907.
Oh, I would certainly not remember the specific day, but I remember both many things that happened before statehood, let us say. I remember when I was 4 years old, one day I went down to the barber shop. My sister Cleo took me down for my first haircut, and I was so impressed that I fainted. And so that was a rather inauspicious beginning too, you know. I was never up to anything that I should be. I was never a cowboy type, you know. Things were always happening to me adversely. And I don't think most people that I knew when I grew up here thought I would live to be 21 years of age, you know. I was in and out. I had the asthma and was bothered with other ailments. I didn't go out and play as hard as most children would likely do, because they were afraid it might be the end of me. In fact, I've heard that my mother came to school at recess to see if I was still alive.
What are some other things that happened before statehood?
Before statehood?
Yeah.
Well, of course, let me see. If I was born in 1902 and statehood was in 1907, that would be my preschool. I can remember doing things like running away, for instance. and being admonished by my mother upon her return and my discovery, but at the same time they thought that I would perhaps be hardier if they got me a pony and let me ride around the country, you know, and the pony could often tell my wheezing when I got an attack of asthma, and he'd take me home. And so that would be helpful too, but that was...
Did you know your grandparents?
Yes, I knew my grandparents on my mother's side, my grandfather, that is, because he lived and visited here. He lived in Missouri and would come down here to Oklahoma to visit his children. He had several children who migrated to Oklahoma. My mother was the first. And then, of course, there was Mrs. Wagner, her sister, and she had there were 3 brothers who also came down from time to time and then lived down here. Ultimately, I had an uncle working in the dry goods store there that Mr. Wagner ran, and some of those brothers came down and did farming for him. You see, he accumulated a number of farms as he was prospering in the mercantile business, and became very popular with the relatives for that reason, you know.
Mm-hmm. Was your grandfather in the Civil War?
I have heard that he was, but I have no proof of anything of that kind. The grandfather that was here was not in the Civil War,
Yeah.
no, but I had other relatives who were.
When was the first time you met Governor Ferguson?
Well, the first time that I know that I met Governor Ferguson was when he came to our home, and I was a babe in arms, and he leaned over and kissed me. that was what you would call my first. My father and he were very good friends at that time. Later, my father ran a newspaper and became competitor, and they fell out. My father was a Democrat, and the governor was Republican. But for a good number of years, they were close friends, and the Fergusons would frequently visit at our house, and vice versa.
What kind of man was he?
Who, Mr. Ferguson?
Mr. Ferguson.
I really didn't know him well enough to know what kind of a man he was. Traditionally, of course, it got to the point where he and my father were exchanging various questionable names to each other in the newspapers. It was a very vitriolic fight. And just as a kid, of course, I wouldn't have a very high estimation of Mr. Ferguson. But I realized realistically that it was largely a Republican versus Democrat deal, and a competitive situation in newspaper business. And it is like anything else. I think that was the main thing. One was a Republican, the other was a Democrat, and they fought for the pelf that was there. For instance, the County Printing, for instance, and other things. They were just natural rivals, and they were both imaginative, and so they called each other a great many names. I have read some of them.
Do you remember when he was governor, Ferguson?
Oh no, that was before my memory time, really. Right. You see, that would be. He came back here in 1906, and he lost his job before Roosevelt went out. Roosevelt didn't reappoint him for a second term. He appointed some old Spanish War buddy of his, France.
Yeah. Is that the reason he wasn't reappointed?
Yes.
Had he been reappointed, you think he'd have been elected governor?
Well, I don't think so, because in those days, and for a long while, there were just too many Democrats in Oklahoma. You know, Ferguson ran for Congress and was beaten in 1907.
Tell me about World War I.
Well, World War I...
1917, 1918. Was there much work for the war effort?
Oh yes, I think everybody did things like knitting and all, and of course World War I happened to be a pretty good time for the farmers here because of the wheat market. If they hadn't capped the wheat price, that's I believe $3 a bushel. Why, the farmers had made lots of money, but as it was, they all, or a lot of them, most of them started driving Dodge and Ford automobiles and so on. It really was a good time for the farmers, and our casualties were, you know, not large. I know a few of the local boys who did die in the war, but there were not many. So I don't think the World War really touched people except for the patriotic surge that they felt. Mm-hmm. And as you know, probably they had a town out here named Kiel where her relatives lived earlier, and they changed the name of the town to Loyal because they didn't want anything that was Germanic around. And O'Keene was a Germanic community basically up here, and I believe even a person that was supposed to be as even minded as my father referred to O'Keene in the Watonga newspaper as Little Berlin, and so on. You know, and of course there wasn't really much enthusiasm for the war amongst those Germanic people, and there were a lot of them in northern Blaine County here. I don't think the war really touched us, except, you know, as a high schooler, I can remember the end of the war, for instance, when we celebrated the victory and so on, right around town, making a lot of noise and things of that kind. But I don't think that World War I really had a greatly adverse effect on the community. It just had this upsurge of super patriotism that always happens in war, when no matter which side you're on, your side is 100% right, and God is on your side, and so on.
Tell me some more about Armistice Day.
Armistice Day was a big time. They had speeches and celebrated the day. As I said, we went around the town shooting things up. Everybody had a shotgun, and they were very excited. And it was a big day.
How long did the celebrations last?
I don't think more than a day.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a big time. It was a lot of relief because although many people had not been killed, they naturally, a lot of families were affected because a lot of people were drafted, and it was a hard situation.
When did your father establish the bank? What year?
1900.
1900, he established the bank. Okay. The 1920s. What did you do in the 20s?
Well, my father died in 1919 in Los Angeles, suddenly, when he and I went out to visit his sister. And I was left with this newspaper on my hands, and I liked writing and things of that kind, so I took over the newspaper at an absurdly young age, and that was it.
How long did you work at the newspaper?
Well, various periods. I went to college meanwhile, and but I worked and was connected with the newspaper between 1919 and 1928. And I sold out to the postmaster here named Harrison Brown, and left largely because of my asthma. It was so bad here that I felt better if I lived on the coast. So I lived on both California and Florida coast for some time.
The flu epidemic of 1918. Did that hit Watonga pretty bad?
Yes, that hit everybody pretty bad, almost as bad, you know, as the war itself.
Yeah.
For instance, Mr. Ferguson's son lost his life down in Post Field here in Lawton, where he was, and then that I had the flu, and I guess nearly everybody else had the flu. You were often close to death with that because it was a very fatal kind of ailment.
Where'd that flu come from?
It supposedly came from Europe.
With the soldiers?
Yes, that was
What kind of medicines did they use to fight the flu?
I don't know precisely what, if any. They must not have used effective medicines because there were so many casualties, so many deaths from that flu. But,
I guess that
Tradd Ferguson came up here and was buried on account of that. You know, I remember my brother-in-law was down at Post Field with Mr. Ferguson.
yeah, that flu I guess was nationwide, wasn't it? The flu epidemic
What's what?
nationwide,
Oh yes, that's right.
or I guess international then if it came from Europe. Okay. When did you get your first car?
Well, our first car was in 1909. I can remember very well. My father took the family down to Oklahoma City to pick up his car, Ford car that he bought down there. And in those days, nobody knew how to drive a car, you know, so they taught him how to drive. The salesman taught him how to drive on the way back to Watonga, and it took us nearly all day to go from Oklahoma City to Watonga, you know. He would have several punctures, and the car, you know, would get hot, and you would have to sit along the side of the road or go into some farmers and so on. All sorts of things, and the roads were bad. And I can remember coming into town with that new Ford, and I don't remember precisely whether my father was driving at that time or the salesman who was, but anyhow, down here a mile south of town, where it was very sandy in the road, we met a group of family of Indians who were driving in a covered wagon, and when they saw this Ford coming up the way, why, they just left the wagon just as it is and all jumped out, and the entire family and ran for the blackjacks, you know, the woods. They didn't know what happened, but you didn't see many cars even in those days. So it was really an adventure.
Mm-hmm.
And the salesman came up and stayed all night with us, you know, and it was really something to buy an automobile in those days.
How much did the car cost?
Well, I didn't pay for it, but I think it was, about $800, wasn't it, or something like that? And it wasn't a whole lot of money.
Where'd you have the car worked on?
Well, the farmers can fix machinery of various kinds, and when something went wrong with the car, why that was usually a garage. There were not many cars around, but they needed to be fixed.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, Will Cronkite set up a garage down on Main Street here in Watonga, and I think he actually also bought the car after Dr. Kelly had it a while, and so on. But there were not many cars around. They just a few years before that, or 2 or 3 years, they had cars in museums. You went to a museum to see a car, and if a car came to town, why the crowd gathered around and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But this was not the first car in Watonga, but there were not many, maybe half a dozen or so cars.
Did they have any trouble scaring the horses when the cars came into town?
Oh yes. Horses hadn't seen these things before, you know. You can't blame them for.
So what would the people do if a car was coming with the horses?
Well, I think you said here the horses sometimes acted better than the people did. The people were more frightened than the horses because the people, you know, didn't know what was going to happen, and the horses were just wondering what was going to happen. And there's a difference between that.
Where did you meet your wife?
Pardon me?
Where did you meet your wife?
Well, my wife I got from a ranch out here 9 miles northwest of town, and she picked somebody, the brother from my wife.
So you married the
She
Cronkites?
married Buell Cronkite, and I married Blanche Cronkite. Because my wife is still out here with me in Watonga.
Mhm. When did you get married?
1927.
1927. What was Watonga like in the roaring 20s, 1920s?
A good time, part of town, but I think the most of the community would be religious-minded and conservative. My mother died when I was 8, for instance, and I was raised by this aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Wagner. They were good Presbyterians, and the Presbyterians in those days, most of them, and I guess Methodists too, you know, we never had a card in the house. We never had liquor in the house. I never heard my uncle swear in all the time I was living with him. That's unusual, I'll admit. But still, these were pious people for the most part. They were interested in making money and having nice homes, and you know, what you might call being somebody or achievement, and having respect to the community. But there were a lot of people like that, farmers. The Baptists, when I was growing up here, there was no Catholic church. My father, who was a Catholic, his name Kelly, you might expect that. He came down here and to a community where there was no Catholic connection of any kind. He, because I suppose of the environment, that dropped away and became a Mason, so on. And in other words, it was a Protestant community. There was a good deal of prejudice against Catholics, I can remember that, and a good deal of prejudice against, of course, black people and Indians and so on. But the people who were running things were the middle-class business type of white that didn't associate any with black people except to trade with them.
Were there many,
Indians the same way.
Yeah, were there many blacks in this area?
Yes, this area has always had a small minority of blacks. I think you might say they had 7% or so black people and 10% Indians. That would be my judgment.
Were there many flappers here in Watonga in the 20s?
Oh, I think so, yes. You call them, they might not have called themselves flappers, but they were sure flapping.
What would you consider a flapper?
Well, a flapper is a girl who wants to have a good time, first of all, I would think. I don't know what else you would say. They were more interested in having a good time than they were interested in making high marks in school, I would say.
And you weren't a flapper.
But I don't think that by any means the majority of girls were flappers. I think they were just as serious or more so than the boys, because they did better in school. They stayed with school longer. School in those days here didn't have much for farmer boys, really. Only for boys who might want to go to college or so on. In other words, they didn't have, like they do now, these agricultural specialties and so on. It really wasn't a very practical schooling for boys after you got into the high school. You studied Latin and you studied history and so on, but there's not much practical there. And boys tend to drop out. In my high school class, 1920, there were 8 boys and 20 girls, and that's about right. I think for them, they stayed with it. Maybe they were brighter than the boys, but I just think there was less interesting for people that were interested in farming and raising cattle and so on.
Did you go to college?
Yes, I went to college.
Where'd you go?
Yale.
Yale. What year did you go to Yale?
I went to Yale and graduated in 1925. That would be about 1921.
What did you study?
I studied literature, history, and law, things of that kind. I was interested in, newspaper work, events of the day, things like that. Interested me. I was the only man in my class of 1,000 from Oklahoma. I think that's one reason they let me in there, because they wanted to, scatter their geography a little bit. Most of the boys there were graduates of Eastern finishing schools or prep schools, whatever you want to call them. And they largely looked upon me as a kind of hick, which I was, no doubt of that. But it was not my class of people, really. I didn't really belong there.
Why did you go to Yale?
Well, those things are oftentimes coincidence. I met a doctor out in Los Angeles who was a Yale graduate, and he thought, that there was no other college, that you weren't really going to college if you didn't go to Yale. So he got me interested, and I went down to the Yale Club in Los Angeles, and you know how it is. They can, if the right people write, the right people, they can sometimes get you into Yale, although you have no business being there. And that's how it happened to me.
Did you stay on campus or off campus?
Everybody lived on campus, practically everybody.
Okay. You live in the
That's
dormitory? Right. Okay. What was dorm life like at Yale in the 20s?
Well, I found it pretty hard at Yale because I wasn't really prepared to go into Yale, and they had a higher standard of scholarship than I was used to, so I had to study pretty hard, but life in the dorms varied pretty much as it would, I think, most places. There would be the serious type of student, and then there would be the playboy type of student. They didn't mix much. You had people there at Yale, most of them were just rich men's sons who were there to graduate from Yale and to enjoy the privileges of associating with those upper class of people, you might call them, or wealthy people, and perhaps crash in themselves if they weren't already in that group. There's nothing democratic about it.
What did you do for recreation at Yale?
Well, I was pretty serious at Yale. I spent a lot of time in the gymnasium. I said I was kind of fragile growing up here in Watonga, and they got me interested in working out in the gymnasium. And I spent quite a bit of time there, and I worked pretty hard there. I couldn't have stayed in there if I had played around.
Where'd you work?
In your own rooms. You had suites of rooms. You'd have maybe 2 or 3 bedrooms with 2 or 3 students having a common living room.
Okay. Did you have a job while you were at Yale?
No.
No. Okay. What was the price of tuition at that time?
At that time, it was only $600 a year. I think it's near 10,000 now. If not more, maybe 15,000. I really haven't inquired recently. But it's very, very expensive, as you know, to go to school most anywhere.
Right. After your commencement exercise was 1925 at Yale?
I graduated in 1925, yes.
Who gave the commencement speech?
Pardon me?
Who gave the commencement speech?
Well, that's a good question, isn't it?
Okay, what'd you do after college?
Well, I ran the newspaper here in Watonga part of the time, and I also had an idea that metropolitan or cosmopolitan journalism was very glamorous, and I got a job on the Chicago Tribune and went to Paris and worked there for a while, in France. I had a friend here who was running the Watonga Herald. We were running it together. A fellow named Martin Cunningham, who later became congressional secretary. We got busy and supported a candidate for Congress here in the district, and he got elected, and he took Mr. Cunningham with him to Congress when he got elected. His name was Jed Johnson, and he was there for, I believe, 20 years or more. Jed Johnson is a congressman from this district, and he was congressman because we helped elect him. Cunningham knew Johnson before that. He lived with him lived in the same area in Cotton County. So when Jed started running for Congress, Martin Cunningham started writing these editorials in our paper. What a wonderful guy this fellow Jed Johnson was, and most people in the district didn't know it was just a couple of boys up here running the newspaper. And so Jed Johnson picked up these editorials, and he published them in all the other newspapers, you know, and people really got to believing he was a remarkable person. And so he went to Congress. He succeeded Elmer Thomas as congressman.
Okay.
And he stayed there for 20 years. And Cunningham worked with him as administrative secretary.
Mm-hmm. Ever hear of Manuel Herrick?
Yes.
Do you know who he was?
It seems to me that Herrick was a congressman himself, wasn't
Mm-hmm. Do you know anything about him?
he? Wasn't he a Republican?
I'm not sure, but he could read or write.
Nick Gensman was a congressman here, a Republican congressman. While I was at Yale, I remember, you see, in 1920 there was the big upset, and the Democratic congressman was beaten. You know, Scott Ferris was congressman from this area for many years. He was beaten, and a Republican who was just running just for the exercise, named Nick Gensman down here in Lawton, was elected over the Democrat. They never had a Republican in Congress from this area before. So when I was up at Yale, I went down to see Nick Gensman at Washington and visit him. Of course, he's always glad to see me because I own this newspaper out here. And so I got acquainted with him too. So I knew both the Republicans and the Democrats in those days here.
Okay. 1930s. How did the Depression affect the newspaper?
Well, it didn't affect this particular newspaper because we sold it in 1928.
Okay, you sold it.
Yeah.
Why did you sell it?
I was really bothered with the asthma here at the point where I really had to move.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't need to sell it financially because I had other properties too. So I really had to leave because of my health.
Mm-hmm.
That really terminated my newspaper career here.
When did you go to Paris?
Well, in 1925, late in 25.
Mm-hmm. What did you do in Paris?
I was a reporter for the Chicago Tribune edition of there. There were two, at those times, there were two English-speaking editions, two English-speaking newspapers, English newspapers. One was the New York Herald Tribune and Old New York Herald at that time, and the other was Chicago Tribune. Mr. McCormick, had a lot of money, both from the farm machinery business and the Chicago Tribune business, and he wanted to swing a lot in Europe, and of course we were very much interested in Europe after the First World War. He was a military hero, or at least wanted to be. So he invested in this daily newspaper as a part of the glamour, I guess, for the Chicago Tribune itself, which was making a whole lot of money, probably more than any other newspaper in the country in those days. So they ran the two English newspapers then in Paris. There was a large English-speaking population, a lot of Americans living in Europe after the First World War, too.
How'd you like Paris?
Well, I thought as a young man at that time that it was a very interesting, exciting place to live. You know, people are very impressionable at that age. All I had to do mostly was go around from one big hotel to another interviewing prominent Americans who came over there and hoped to get favorable publicity of some kind or other. And so it was an easy kind of life for me at the time, and perhaps a good way to enter that kind of journalism, metropolitan journalism, whatever you might call it.
How long did you stay in Paris?
I was only there until 1926. I came back because I had this Watonga Herald going all the time. I had to come back and see what was happening here.
Mm-hmm. What did you do in the 1930s after you sold the newspaper?
Well, I have worked in newspapers from time to time in Los Angeles and in New York, and I've lived in Florida and so on. I would not put myself up as someone who depended upon the newspaper business for a living, because I did not. I just had enough properties that I didn't have to actually work for a living. I can't pretend that I did.
Mm-hmm. Tell me about the Depression, 1930s. How did that affect you?
Well, the 1930s was, I think, very hard on all young people at that time. It, of course, created disillusionment. To find, let's say a quarter of the whole working force of the country was out of work, and they were selling apples, let us say. There were no unemployment insurance. People, were out on the street, and the middle class too suffered greatly. People who had made a competence in life, many of them lost it within overnight, let us say, or in months, and they were shifted from a middle class position to a position where they might have to move in with somebody in the family or something of that kind. You cannot appreciate the depth and the disaster of the Depression unless you were a person that had to make a living at that time and had no jobs. The government, as you know, had no provision for anybody. It was a very desperate time, and of course it had a very profound effect on people who did any thinking about things. There was a great shift toward radicalism. People just couldn't believe that things could go from something to nothing. I suppose it's an experience that you have to appreciate really the desperateness of people and the way it would shape them and their attitudes toward the government, toward life in general, toward each other. A lot of bitterness, in family life and so on. When you throw people together who haven't been together and expose them to all kinds of hardship. Mm-hmm. Here in this area, people would be getting 25 and 30 cents a bushel for wheat, and you were just out. Of course, they'd had a very bad economic depression here after the First World War, mm-hmm. in the early 20s. There was no more $3 wheat, for instance, and prices went down to the point where people were hard up. That was all.
Did you lose any of your properties in the Depression?
No, I can't say that I did, because I didn't have anything heavily encumbered or anything of that kind. But in other words, I will have to admit that I was something of an innocent bystander. But at the same time, you cannot help but be deeply affected by the injustice of the situation that arises, where so many of the people are utterly declassed, so to speak, and millions hungry.
Did you live in Watonga in those years, in the 30s?
No, I was in and out of Watonga, but I really didn't live in Watonga. I was in and out, visiting my relatives here and looking after what few properties I had around.
Ever go through any dust storms here?
Well, yesterday and the day before. Yes, I have. You can't live here, as you probably know, without going through dust storms that last as much as a week at least.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the more disagreeable facts about life in Oklahoma. I don't think you're really getting away from that. But it all in all has an equitable climate, and really the country is so fertile, and that was one of my problems, that there was so much pollen around that gave me the asthma that I couldn't stay here.
World War II. Did you do any work for the war effort in the Second World War?
No, I can't say that I did, except I was working as a newspaper person. I was too old for the Second World. No, don't say I'd be too old for the second and too young for the first.
Yeah.
So I was never. I don't know I could ever pass the test for that matter, getting in the Army or the Navy. I never had to. But I was just one of those, let's not say fortunate people, who was in that age bracket, so that I didn't have to serve in the war.
You say that you worked as a newspaper person in
That's
the war?
right. In New York. I was working.
In New York. Did you cover the victory parades?
Did I participate in the victory parade?
Did you cover the victory parades when the soldiers came back?
Oh, I covered a little bit of everything, but not precisely,
Okay.
let us say, that sort of
Okay.
thing. That's right.
When did you return to Watonga to stay?
I came back to Watonga a year ago, February, and I bought a home, the first home that we've had in all our married lives here in Watonga. That is really own a home. You know, if you live in cities, you don't live in private homes normally. You live in apartment houses, and so.
And did you live in New York City before you came back here?
That's right.
Okay.
I lived in New York City mostly from about 1939 on until
Is your turn now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you through with me now?
No.
No,
just-
the Ford automobile in 1909, the Lee Huckins Hotel was the headquarters.
Lee Huckins Hotel. Is
Yeah,
that where you
that's made in
stayed?
Broadway in those days. You know.
Is that where you stayed, the Huckins Hotel?
Yeah, well, when we went down there, we always stayed at Huckins Hotel. You'd go down there on the train in the evening. We had a train on the Rock Island, went down in the evening and came back in the morning. You had to get up at 5 o'clock to go over to the Rock Island station from the Huckins, walk 2 or 3 blocks to get to the Rock Island station, take the train up to Watonga, which got here after stops at El Reno and Garrett for quite a while. They got here about 9 o'clock in the morning. And that's the train accommodations that we had here. And then we had the Rock Island line on the east side of town, which went between Enid and Waurika. And the trains usually met here about noon or 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
Somebody's home. I got a key in the
And,
door and I can't get the key out.
Oh, where was it?
In the very early days here, that was the Choctaw Northern on that route. That ran between Oklahoma City and Alva. And then the Rock Island took it over.
Over and try it again.
So they continued to run the trains. But actually, the Rock
Excuse me.
Island, I think they were lasted here until the 1930s, didn't they? The railroad lasted here and they had regular rail
Yes.
service.
Good. See, they moved the capital to Oklahoma City in 1910, I believe. Did you have any thoughts on moving the capital?
No, I was of course very young in 1910. I would be 8 years of age. But of course I heard about those things, heard people talk about them. Oklahoma politics, as far as I was concerned, was rather common place thing to talk about, because my father was so involved in them. He ran this Watonga Herald from 1906 on to the time of his death in 1919, and he was very active in politics He was a delegate to the national conventions and so forth in 1908 and 12 and 16. He ran, I remember, for corporation commissioner 1918. I think he came in second in the nomination. But he was an active person and made, I suppose you could say, his living partially from politics. He was an organizer for the Democratic Party and knew all of the people down there. I used to go to the Capitol with him. Occasionally as a kid, he'd take me along, you know, now and then. But,
when you sold the newspaper, who did you sell it to?
told to Harrison Brown, postmaster here. He had also ran newspapers here before, and he was a Republican wheel horse. Had been a state senator, and was at one time an editor, manager of the Republican while Ferguson was governor. They hired Harrison Brown to manage the thing, and he and Mrs. Ferguson had a falling out, I think, because Harrison Brown was postmaster in those days. Later, when I was running the newspaper, Harrison Brown was postmaster, and I think Mrs. Ferguson refused to support him for a new term as postmaster, and that was the reason he came over to me and wanted to buy the newspaper, because he wanted to kick Mrs. Ferguson around a little, you know, because she had probably been kicking him around. I don't know. You know how politics can become quite a personal thing. You're a friend and buddy one day, and the next month it may be quite different.
Right. How long did the Herald last before it?
I think the Herald was sold about 1934. That would be my remembrance. But
Then did it join with the Republican?
and then the Republican Herald joined. Yes, that's right. And there's only been the Republican here since then. I don't believe anyone has ever successfully started and run a newspaper here since that time.
Man, do you have any questions?
Don't really, I guess.
Anything that we haven't covered?
No, I think you've done a pretty thorough job here, and I
Thank you.
appreciate getting to meet you and talk about it. I'll come down to perhaps sometime and ask you some questions about Oklahoma history.
Sure, come on, I'll tell you what I can.
I'm sure that you know a lot more about it than I do, because I've been out of state so much.
Well, I've learned a lot with this job, traveling the state, talking to the people. I've learned a lot. Thank you.
Yes.